This is the moral argument which proves the existence of God. You have to decide for yourself if you think the argument is a good one or a bad one. Each person has to decide. 1. Right and wrong exists if and only if God exists. 2. Right and wrong exists. 3. Therefore, God exists. This is a logically valid argument. What that means is that if 1 and 2 are true, then 3 must be true. Everyone should be able to see this. This is a very old argument that Christians have used to defend the existence of God for over 1,000 years. So, are 1 and 2 true? When most people hear an argument for God's existence, they immediately think of a reason why that proof for God fails. Pretty much every single person thinks this way. Usually they think that their defeater for the argument is a total deal breaker. So most people just stop listening at this point and never learn that they haven't defeated the argument at all. In reality, the only reason they think they have defeated the argument is because they haven't taken the time to carefully understand it. The defeater is usually destroyed with a merely better understanding of the argument itself. The most common defeater for this argument is this: you don't have to believe in God to be a good person. Atheists can be good people too. The problem with this defeater is that it literally affirms the second premise, or number 2. The second premise of the moral argument is simply that everyone knows what is good and what is evil. The only question is how such a thing as good and evil can exist in the first place. The argument is based on that idea that atheists know how to be good. The question is how there can be such a thing as good and evil if there is no God. That brings us to the next defeater for the argument, and it goes something like this. Evolution can explain morality. There is an evolutionary benefit to protecting other members of your species. So we evolved morality. Morality comes from evolution. This defeater also fails miserably. Do we think murder is wrong because we evolved that way as a species? Or did we evolve that way because it's wrong? It becomes clear very fast that morality founded on evolution would be a mere illusion. If our brains have evolved to tell us that murder is wrong, why on earth is it really wrong? Why should we think that however we evolved also happens to be good? It's just what happened. Many insist that this defeater of evolved morality still means that we have no proof for God. They say that we could have evolved this way, and morality would therefore be an illusion. The famous atheist Richard Dawkins says this about it: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. As that unhappy poet A. Housman put it, for nature, heartless, witless, nature will neither care nor know. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. River Out of Eden, 1995, page 133. Many like Dawkins are quite happy to agree that morality is an illusion and a byproduct of evolution when you press them on this point. But they insist that all of our notions of good and evil can still be created by evolution, even if they are an illusion created by evolution. The truth of the matter is that evolution cannot create the illusion of morality. Evolution cannot even create the simple idea of good and evil. Let's say that evolution programmed you to think that survival is good and to die is bad. You were programmed with a goal like survival, and we humans call that evolutionary programming good. We also call the things that we are programmed not to do evil. Let's ask an important question. Do you think that a murderer is evil if he or she has no control over committing the murder? What if the murderer is completely under the control of another, like a puppet? Obviously, in that case, the murderer is not responsible and not really evil. Furthermore, you are not really good if you are not in control either. So if you have a goal of being good, then you have a goal of doing something that you weren't programmed to do. Even if you want to be evil, you have a goal of doing something you weren't programmed to do. Therefore, if evolution programmed you with a goal of being good, then you were programmed with a goal of not being programmed. I will say that again. If evolution programmed you with a goal of being good, then evolution programmed you with a goal of not being programmed. That is impossible. You cannot be controlled into an act of not being controlled. You cannot be forced into a desire to not be forced into a desire. You cannot program a computer not to be programmed because it would simply be following its own programming. Therefore, the very idea of good and evil can never be the product of evolution. If our goals like survival for ourselves or other members of our human species were just programmed into us, then how would we react if something got in the way? How would we react if an accident happened and a bunch of people died? We wouldn't really care. We would just recalculate, like an automobile GPS does when you take a wrong turn. It's a machine, and it's just following its programming. Evolution cannot program you to have a goal of not being programmed, which is exactly what being good always is. You are neither good nor evil if someone else is in complete control of what you do. Therefore, evolution cannot create the idea of good and evil. This brings us to the next supposed defeater for the moral argument for God's existence. People often say that people create the rules of right and wrong. This idea is more popular with younger people. It's called subjective morality and the rejection of objective morality. They say that humans create the rules and call some things good and other things evil. So this idea is given as a defeater for the moral argument for God's existence. To back this point up, they give examples of how different human societies have had very different notions of good and evil. For example, the Nazis thought it was okay to torture and kill the Jews. The Allies thought it was evil. So it is argued that societies create morality. This defeater begs us to ask one large question. What do you really think? Do you think it's okay to torture and kill Jews, or do you think it's evil? If our moral ideas of right and wrong are just created by societies, then one group isn't right while the other is wrong. This group just thinks what it thinks, and the other thinks something else, while neither of their ideas are true, objectively. They are just what each group thinks, subjectively. So what do you really think? Will you side with the Allies to defeat the Nazis? But that means that if you decide to attack the Nazis for being evil, then you must think they are evil, right? Objectively, right? Amazingly, some people will claim that it would be right for them to attack the Nazis because that's what their society believes, while if they were born a Nazi, then it would be right to torture and kill the Jews. So they insist that societies create morality. They say morality is subjective. In reality, the problem goes much deeper. In philosophy, this is called an existential problem. You cannot exist like this. As soon as you do anything, you choose it because you consider it better than the alternative that you didn't choose. For example, are you going to continue to take baths or showers? Of course you are, right? If you want to keep your body free of disease and infection, you don't want to die, do you? Well, if nothing is really good or bad, and it's all a matter of opinion, then why don't you decide that it's better to be dead? In that case, you can certainly skip the bath and put a gun to your head instead. But then you would be believing that it's better to be dead. And that still wouldn't be the case if humans just make up morality. If humans just make up what's right and what's wrong, then it's no better to be dead than it is to be alive. If that's the case, then how do you make choices at all? What will you do when every single choice requires you to believe in right and wrong, which is something that you say is untrue, that there is no such thing as right and wrong? Namely, you say that nothing is better than anything else in objective reality beyond what societies think. You say that good and evil are totally different depending on what one person's opinion is compared to another person's opinion. Therefore, you can't make any choices because every choice requires you to believe that which you say is not true. As soon as you make a choice, you are also believing that it's better than the alternative choice. So you cannot make choices while also believing that there is no real good and bad. Of course, you might argue and say that you can just make a choice by just making a happy self-delusion. You might just roll the dice and just pick one option over another. So you roll the dice and it comes up telling you that living is better than dying. But even then, how did you decide to roll the dice? Why make a choice that way at random? Why did you choose to do that when no action is better than another action? The fact of the matter is we can't escape believing that doing one thing is better than doing another thing. If this was not the case, then all human decision making would stop, because human decisions cannot happen without that belief. But clearly humans make decisions all the time. Therefore, how do they do it? The only way they can do it is if they have some real knowledge of what is truly good and what is truly evil. Without such knowledge, all human decisions would come to an end, and we would all be frozen in time. Humans would cease to make choices without believing that they have real knowledge of right and wrong. Humans cannot avoid this by just picking something at random, because that choice would still be believed to be better than the alternative. Since humans continue to make choices, then humans must have knowledge of true right and wrong. This brings us to our next defeater. Many argue that the God of the Bible is evil, and therefore God cannot be the foundation of good and evil. Sadly, this defeater comes from a lack of careful study of the Bible, and really just a blind faith in what other atheists say. Richard Dawkins says it like this: the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynist, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. I think he might need to look up sadomasochist. And megalomaniacal doesn't make any sense. It means you believe you're bigger than you really are. I mean, but if God's really God, then he technically can't believe he's bigger than he is. Anyway, Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. This is grossly untrue. If you believe this without checking what Dawkins says against the Bible, then I do have a magic jar of beans I would like to sell you. It's only going to cost you everything you own, but they're magic beans, after all. The Old Testament covers a large collection of very ancient books. But to understand this issue, we need to return to the issue of human knowledge of good and evil from before. As we said, humans must have this knowledge. But here's the thing, it has to be a cloudy knowledge. Clearly, humans make mistakes. We often think that what we did was right, and later we realize that it was actually bad and we shouldn't have done it. The fact that we continue to strive to be good even though we have this cloudy knowledge and are fully aware that we have made mistakes and that we're often mistaken of knowledge of good and evil, really that serves to illustrate that we must have some sort of knowledge, otherwise our choice making would stop. If we did not, then as we said, all human decision making would come to an end. It really would be impossible. This basic human knowledge of good and evil is what philosophers call the moral sense. It's not unlike your other senses. When something is right in front of your face, you can see it clearly. When it's far away, then you know something about it, but it's unclear. The moral sense is like that too. Some situations are obvious. For example, murdering infants is clearly evil. But other situations are more difficult. Should struggling nations be forced to adopt environmental regulations that may cripple their economy? It's a little more cloudy. Because the moral sense is cloudy, this means that there's room for progress. Human cultures and humanity as a whole can actually make advancements in moral understanding and grow in a more refined and accurate knowledge of what is good and what is evil. The Old Testament entered a world where many things we think of today as evil were seen as perfectly good. For example, the ancient world saw no problem with forcing people into slavery. But it was actually the religion that sprang up from the Bible which did away with slavery and created our new, modern, refined understanding of good and evil. I doubt Richard Dawkins took the time to read the Bible verses where God literally outlaws forcing people to work for you. Forcing people into bondage is not the slavery that the Old Testament's talking about. Slavery in the Old Testament regarded the poor being unable to support themselves and having no other options but to sell themselves into slavery. Slavery is often not caused by force in this world, but by poverty. Therefore, the Old Testament enacted many laws to handle how the poor found work. It was really a system to get the poor out of slavery. And the Old Testament even said that if you follow this system, you will eliminate poverty from your land. Now think about it. With such a grossly incorrect claim about the Old Testament from atheists like Richard Dawkins, do you really think it's wise to only listen to him or other atheists that agree with him? Perhaps, going out on a limb here, perhaps you would be wise to look at the other side of the case. Now, this brings us up to our final defeater for the moral argument for God. It comes to us from the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. Socrates famously asked Euthyphro, "Do the gods command it because it's good? Or is it good because the gods command it?" Atheists like Dawkins actually still use this argument, even though it's really old, and they never seem to do it when anyone is allowed to respond. This argument doesn't apply to the God of Christianity as well as it did to those of ancient Greece. The idea is that if God commands us to be good because it's good for Him to do so, then there's some law that sits over God and judges God's actions as either good or bad. Therefore, He wouldn't really be God. But if something is good because God commanded it, then that's a problem too. Could God just have magically made it okay to murder infants? Our cloudy moral sense tells us that this is wrong. And this second point is what many atheists like to harp on. They say that we Bible-thumping Christians believe things like rape, murder, and theft, and lying are wrong because God says so. But then they proudly tell us that they don't need God to tell them something like that because they just know that things like that are wrong. They say that if you need God to tell you to do that, then you're a pretty messed up person. If you would actually go around and start raping, murdering, and killing and stealing, until you saw that Bible verse and now you're not going to do it anymore, and they say that's a joke. Now, the funny part is, the atheists are agreeing with the Christians again, but they still manage to pretend that they aren't and make us look bad, even though they're actually agreeing with what we think. It's kind of weird. They do that all the time. Atheists love to say things that Christians agree with and then parade it around like they're the only ones who say it. The Christians don't believe murder and theft are wrong because God commands it. True, there are some Christians who do. But this is a question of God and where the rules of good and evil come from that was dealt with by Christians a long time ago. Christians believe that God is goodness itself, that goodness is God Himself. I'll say that again. We believe that God is goodness itself. We do often say that God is good, don't we? We believe that the rules in the Bible are really descriptions of God's perfectly good nature. Goodness is not above God or below God. Goodness is God. The Bible even affirms over and over that God is love itself. So when you believe in goodness, what Christians believe is that you're believing in God. And so to do something evil is to not believe in God. Now, the biblical God is a God who is the foundation of morality. And we have proven that such a God must exist. But that does not prove that Jesus of Nazareth was God in the flesh, crucified for our sins, and raised up on the third day. To prove those things, it would take more proof. But the existence of God is a big step, isn't it? And since we know that God is goodness itself, then we can actually rule out many religions other than Christianity. For example, the God of Hinduism is said to have once been one being that forgot how to be itself and separated out into all living things. This is called pantheism. In other words, everybody and everything is God. That means that every evil thing each person has done is actually something God has done. For Christians, man is to blame for evil. But for Hindus, God is to blame. That clearly is not a being who is goodness itself, which we have proven that such a being must exist. So this religion cannot be true. Now, many criticize the Christian God for simply allowing evil to exist in the first place. Now, allowing it to exist is obviously very different from being the cause of all of it. If the Christian God exists, He must be very great, right? To be the very foundation of goodness, one must be good in every conceivable way, and that would mean that anything which makes one better, one would have to have that to the maximum. So God would be maximally good. Therefore, God would have to be so far beyond our comprehension that we can't even conceive of the gap, how big the distance is. Thus, God could have reasons for allowing evil, and we should expect it to be difficult to understand. If everything God did made perfect sense to us, then would He really be God? There is another religion that was born out of a rejection of Hinduism. Buddhism. There is no God of Buddhism. Buddha taught that to achieve enlightenment, one must cease all desire. Once that happens, then one can never suffer again. To do this, one must follow the middle way and basically do all things in moderation. But I ask, why do this? If the God of perfect goodness exists, why not praise and worship a being who is ultimately great in every way? Furthermore, to be perfectly good, wouldn't this being also have to have a perfectly good plan for your life? Christians agree that we often suffer because we desire the wrong things. We agree with Buddhists on that. But why should we not worship a being of perfect goodness who really does exist? Why cease all desires? If a God of ultimate goodness exists, then aren't some things worth suffering for? Why give up on all suffering? Does the goal of ending all suffering by ending all desire really make sense? Now, finally, let's take a look at Islam. No two religions in the world are as similar as Christianity and Islam. But whose God is truly maximally great? The Muslim God won't forgive many, many sins. But the Christian God will forgive any wrongdoing except the failure to accept forgiveness. He won't force forgiveness on you if you don't want it. But the Muslim God prescribes many time limits where one can exceed them and then forget about forgiveness. Furthermore, the Muslim God has lower standards of righteousness to boot. He doesn't expect perfection, but rather gives a specific set of rules to follow. But the Christian God says that one little sin condemns you to eternal punishment unless you receive forgiveness. So I ask, which God has the higher standards? Which God is more forgiving? And really, which God cares the most about what you do with your life? To which God does your life have the most meaning? Which God sees the things you do as the most important? To which God do you and your life matter the most? Which God cares the most about what you do? Which God cares the most about what happens to you? And which God has the higher respect for your choices?